She offered $150 for his Rolls-Royce. 18 days later, he auctioned it for $7M. 14 collectors stood in a climate-controlled storage unit on the east side of Hargrove County, each one of them wearing shoes that cost more than a month of Mason Wyatt's rent. The car in front of them was a 1962 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud II. Faded in silver paint. One cracked taillight. A rear bumper held in place with 2 bolts and a prayer. And Mason was standing beside it in a jacket with a fraying left cuff, one hand resting on the roof panel, the other holding a small stuffed elephant named Pip. Pip belonged to his 6-year-old daughter, Callie. She was sitting on an overturned milk crate behind him, both feet dangling. Watching the room, the way children watch rooms when they know something important is happening, but can't name what it is. Then the woman in the center stepped forward. She looked at the car. She looked at Mason. She opened her wallet and offered him $150. Stay with this one. What happened in the next 18 days is something none of those collectors saw coming. Not one of them. Her name was Vivienne Holt. She was 31 years old, 18 months into her role as CEO of Holt Meridian Group, a private acquisitions firm that specialized in what the industry called distressed luxury assets, a polished phrase for buying things from people who needed money badly enough to take whatever was offered. She had inherited the company from her father, who had built it across 32 years and 412 acquisitions. She had a board that doubted her. She had a vice president named Carter Pruitt, who had been with the firm since she was in high school. And she had, on the morning of October the 3rd, a tip from Carter that a man in Hargrove County had a 1962 Silver Cloud II sitting in a storage unit. A barn find, unregistered, uninsured, owner in financial distress. Carter had delivered the tip with his silver cufflinks glinting under the fluorescent lights of the conference room. He had smiled the way a man smiles when he already knows how the room will end. He had told Vivienne this was a fast acquisition, a clean one. He said the owner was a single father, some kind of handyman, no legal representation. He said $150 would do it. Maybe $200 if the man pushed back. Vivienne had written it down. She had not asked questions. Mason Wyatt was 32 years old. He had calloused hands from 5 years of working a maintenance route across 3 apartment complexes on the north side of Hargrove. He had a 4-door truck with a cracked dashboard and 114,000 miles on it. He had a daughter named Callie, who was 6 years old, and who carried a small stuffed elephant named Pip everywhere she went. Pip had one eye missing, the left one, lost somewhere in a laundromat 2 winters ago. Callie had decided this made Pip distinguished, which was the word she had heard her father use about old things with damage. He had smiled when she said it. He had not corrected her. The car had been his wife's. Elena Wyatt had died 22 months earlier. A Tuesday evening in December, a wet intersection, a delivery truck that ran a red light at 42 miles per hour. She was 30 years old. Callie had been 4. Mason had gotten the call at 7 minutes past 9 in the evening, while he was heating up soup on the stove. And Callie was asleep in the next room, with Pip tucked under her arm. He had not sold the car after she died. He had not sold it for 6 months after that. He had not sold it for a year. It sat in the storage unit on Fenwick Road in the same condition Elena had loved it. Imperfect, a little worn, smelling faintly of old leather and the lavender she used to keep in a tin on the back shelf. He went by twice a month to check on it. He sat in the driver's seat sometimes. He did not start the engine. He just sat. But the water heater in the apartment had failed in September, and the property manager had told him the repair was his responsibility. And Callie needed new winter boots, and the storage fees were 3 months behind. He had called the number Carter Pruitt had left on the community board at the hardware store on 5th Avenue. He had not known who Carter was. He had not known who Holt Meridian Group was. He had been told someone might be interested in a classic car. He had written down the address of the storage unit, and he had arranged to meet them on a Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. He had brought Callie because there was no one to leave her with. She had brought Pip because she brought Pip everywhere. The 14 collectors were not buyers. They were theater. Carter had arranged them. Associates, contract appraisers, 2 men from a competing dealership who owed him favors. The rest pulled together from a network of people who understood that their job this morning was to be present, to stand in an unimpressed circle, to make the asset look like a problem nobody wanted. Mason had looked at them when he arrived. He had looked at the circle of expensive shoes. He had set Pip down on the milk crate beside Callie, and he had folded his hands in front of him and waited. Vivian Holt had walked toward the car slowly. She had circled it once. She had noted the cracked taillight, the soft tires, the surface rust near the rear left wheel arch. She had looked at Mason, and she had opened her wallet. $150. Mason looked at the money, not at her, at the money. He was quiet for 4 full seconds. He said, "No, thank you." She had not expected that. Carter had told her the man would fold. Carter had told her it was a distressed seller. Carter had told her 150, maybe 200. She increased the offer to 225. Mason picked up Pip from the milk crate and handed the elephant to Callie without looking. Away from Vivienne, he put a hand on the car's roof panel. He said the car wasn't for sale at that price. Vivienne tilted her head. She said something about the cost of storage, the condition of the vehicle, the difficulty of finding a buyer for an unregistered silver cloud in that state. She said it pleasantly. She said it as though she were doing him a favor. Carter Pruitt smiled from the edge of the circle. Mason said, "I understand." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. He set it on the hood of the car. He smoothed it flat with one hand. It was a handwritten list, 7 items, each one numbered, he said. "Those are the things that need to be addressed before I'd consider a sale." He said it the way a man says a thing he's already thought through entirely. Quiet, flat, no performance. Vivian looked at the list. She looked at the circle of 14 people. She looked at Mason. She said, "That's not how this works." Mason picked up the list, refolded it, put it back in his jacket pocket. He reached for Callie's hand. He said, "Then we're done here." He did not say it with anger. He did not say it with bitterness. He said it the same way he might say, "It's time to go to a child who is ready for lunch." Callie slid off the milk crate. She held Pip against her chest with both arms. She looked up at Vivian Holt with the steady, unblinking attention that 6-year-olds give to things they're trying to understand. Mason locked the storage unit. He put Callie in the truck. He drove home. Carter Pruitt watched them go. His smile did not change. What Carter told Vivian afterward was this: the man had no leverage. The car was unregistered. The storage fees were delinquent. He had confirmed that with the facility manager, who owed him a conversation. The property records showed Mason Wyatt was 2 months behind on his apartment utilities. Carter said if they waited him out 10 days, maybe 14, the man would call back with a different number in mind. Vivian had sat in the conference room and looked at her coffee going cold on the table. She had not loved how the morning had gone. She had not loved the way the man had looked at her. Not with anger, not with pride, not with the resentment she was accustomed to receiving in distressed acquisitions. He had looked at her with something closer to patience, like she was a problem that would eventually resolve itself. She had told Carter to proceed. She did not know what proceed meant, not entirely. She knew Carter had methods. She had known that since she was 23, watching her father sit across from Carter in this same conference room, nodding at the same half-smile. She had told herself then that her father was the one with authority. She told herself now that the Rolls-Royce was a legitimate acquisition, and the offer was fair given the vehicle's condition. She wrote those words in her notebook. She underlined them. She did not sleep well that night. What Carter did in the 3 days that followed was methodical. He contacted the storage facility and spoke to the manager about the delinquent account. He suggested that a lien notice properly filed would accelerate the owner's decision-making. He arranged for a tow company to perform a preliminary assessment of the vehicle, which gave him, on paper, documentation that the car had been evaluated at a market value of $900, given its non-running status and unregistered title. He filed that assessment with 3 pages of supporting photographs, all taken from unflattering angles, all taken after he had deflated 1 additional tire. On the 4th day, he sent Mason Wyatt a certified letter. The letter was from a property law firm on Clearwater Street. It stated that based on recent assessments, the vehicle was subject to a storage lien totaling $411, and that if the balance was not satisfied within 7 days, the facility held the right to sell the vehicle to recover costs. It quoted a state statute. It had a seal at the bottom. The statute was real. The firm was real. The seal was real. What was not real was the signature at the bottom. The letter had been signed by an attorney named Gerald Booth. Gerald Booth had been dead for 8 months. Carter had used his firm's letterhead. He had known Gerald for 11 years. He had a key to Gerald's home office. Mason Wyatt received the letter on a Thursday morning. He read it at the kitchen table, while Callie ate oatmeal across from him, with Pip propped against the sugar bowl. He read it twice. He set it down. Callie said, "What's that?" He said, "A letter from some people." She said, "Is it about the car?" He said, "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. She picked up Pip and held the elephant to her chest the way she did when she wanted to think. Mason folded the letter back into its envelope. He put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept important papers. The drawer with Elena's insurance documents, Callie's birth certificate, his maintenance license, and a small photograph of the 3 of them standing in front of the silver cloud in summer. Elena laughing, her hand on the hood, Callie on her hip. He sat for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called a number he had not called in 4 years. The number belonged to a man named Walter Okafor. Walter was 61 years old. He had spent 27 years as a senior assessor for the Hemsley Burn auction house in London, before retiring to Hargrove County to be near his daughter and her children. He was a large man with careful hands and a deliberate way of speaking that made every sentence feel like a conclusion. He had known Mason for 9 years. He had known Elena before that. He had attended her funeral. He had brought soup to the apartment 3 different times in the first month after she died, each time leaving it outside the door without knocking, because he understood that some grief needs to be managed privately. Mason had helped Walter repair a heat exchanger in his basement 4 years ago. Walter had watched Mason work, the precision of it, the patience, the way he identified the problem without guessing. Walter had said, over coffee afterward, that he suspected Mason had done work like that before. Not maintenance work, more specific work. Mason had looked at his cup and said he'd picked things up over the years. Walter had not pushed. He pushed now, gently. When Mason came to his house on the Thursday evening with the letter in his jacket pocket and Callie asleep in the truck, outside with Pip tucked under her arm, Walter opened the door and looked at him for a moment and said, "Come in. Tell me all of it." Mason sat at Walter's kitchen table. He told him about the storage unit. He told him about Vivienne Holt and the $150 and the 14 collectors in expensive shoes. He told him about Carter Pruitt's smile. He pulled out the certified letter and unfolded it and set it on the table. Walter read it. He read it a second time. He set it down and was quiet. He said, "Gerald Booth died in February." Mason looked at him. Walter said, I know because his wife is in my Tuesday bridge group. She mentioned it was a difficult spring. Mason looked at the signature on the letter. Not fear, not rage. Something slower than that. Recognition. Walter got up and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Mason and sat back. Down, he said. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me plainly, he said. This car, do you know what you actually have? Mason looked at the table for a moment. He looked at the window. He said, I have an idea. Walter waited. Mason was quiet for a long time. Then he said, the car belonged to Elena's grandfather. He was in the import business in the 1960s. He brought it over from England. There was some paperwork with it when Elena inherited it. Original ownership documents, service records, and one other thing. He paused. A letter. From the factory. About who the car was originally commissioned for. Walter was very still. Mason reached into his jacket and pulled out a second folded paper. Not the certified letter, a different one. Older. The edges were soft with age. The paper was cream-colored, heavier than modern stock. He unfolded it carefully on Walter's table. Walter looked at it. He put his glasses on. He read it. He read it again. He set his coffee cup down without drinking from it. He said, Mason. Mason said, I know. Walter said, this is a provenance letter. From the factory floor. Dated 1962. This car was a custom commission. He looked up. Do you know who commissioned it? Mason said the name. Walter sat back in his chair. He exhaled through his nose. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Mason. He said, how long have you known? Mason said, Elena knew. She told me after we'd been married 2 years. She said her grandfather had told her to never sell it to someone who didn't understand what it was. Walter said, and you were going to let a woman offer you $150 for it. Mason said, I wasn't going to sell it. Walter looked at him. Then he said, what do you want to do? Mason looked at the window again. Outside in the truck, Callie was asleep. He thought about the water heater. He thought about the winter boots. He thought about Elena's hand on the hood of the car in summer, laughing. He said, I want to do this right. Walter nodded. He picked up his phone. He said, then I'm making a call. The call went to a man named Adrian Walsh. Adrian was 68 years old and had been the senior director of the Hemsley-Burn-Hargrove division for 11 years. He answered on the second ring because Walter Okafor did not call in the evenings without reason. Walter spoke for 4 minutes. Adrian was silent on his end. When Walter finished, Adrian said, send me photographs of the letter tonight. Walter photographed the provenance document with his phone and sent the images. Adrian called back in 17 minutes. He said, I want to see this in person. Can we do Saturday? Walter looked at Mason. Mason said Saturday is fine. Adrian Walsh arrived at Walter's house at 9 in the morning on Saturday with a gray canvas bag and the bearing of a man who had handled important objects for 40 years. He wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He set a magnifying lamp on Walter's kitchen table. He put on cotton gloves. He looked at the provenance letter for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he looked at the photographs of the car on Mason's phone. He studied the VIN. He cross-referenced it against a small leather notebook he carried in his bag. He looked at Mason. He said, this vehicle was a private commission ordered through the Rolls-Royce factory in Crewe in April of 1962. It was delivered to a single buyer in June of that year. That buyer was one of 8 people on Earth who received a factory-certified, personally approved Silver Cloud 2 with full coachwork specification that year. He set the photographs down. 3 of the 8 are known to the auction market. 2 have sold at major houses in the last decade. The most recent, which was in worse condition than yours, sold for $4,300,000 in Geneva. Mason looked at the table. Adrian said, yours has original coachwork and an intact provenance chain. With the factory letter and the service records, your estimated sale range at auction is between $5.5 and $7.2 million. Callie was sitting at the end of Walter's kitchen table with a glass of orange juice and Pip. She was looking at the provenance letter the way children look at things they've been told are special. Not with full comprehension, but with a seriousness that said she understood. This was a moment to be quiet for. Mason said nothing for a while. He looked at the letter. He looked at his hands on the table. He thought about Elena. He thought about a Tuesday in December. He thought about soup on a stove and a phone ringing at 9:09. He said, "What do we need to do?" Adrian Walsh said, "We need to register it. We need to document the provenance formally. And we need to choose a house." He looked at Walter. He looked back at Mason. "We can have this on the block in 3 weeks. 14 days to prepare, 4 days of pre-auction preview, then the sale." Mason said, 18 days from now. Adrian said, "Give or take." Mason put his hand flat on the provenance letter. He did not press hard. He just let it rest there, the way you rest your hand on something you don't want to lose. He said, "Let's do it." Carter Pruitt found out on a Wednesday. He found out from a contact at the storage facility who had seen 2 men arrive with a transport vehicle, proper insurance paperwork, and a signed release of lien that had been settled in full by a bank transfer at 8:47 that morning. The car had been removed. The unit was empty. Carter sat in his car in the parking lot of the storage facility for a moment. Then he drove to the office. Then he began making calls. The first call was to a man who knew Adrian Walsh's assistant. The second was to a dealer in the Classic Car Network who monitored auction registrations in 3 states. By 1 in the afternoon, the picture had come together enough that Carter felt the first cold edge of something that was not quite fear, but was very close to it. A 1962 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud II had been registered for auction at the Hemsley Burn Hargrove house. The provenance letter had been authenticated by 2 independent experts. The vehicle had been formally assessed at an estimated sale value of between $5.8 and $7.2 million. The owner of record was Mason Wyatt. Carter sat at his desk. He looked at the certified letter he had sent. He looked at Gerald Booth's signature at the bottom of it, copied from an old document, applied with a fine ballpoint, exactly as Gerald had always signed his name. He made a 3rd call. He did not reach who he was looking for. He made a 4th call. He told that person that they needed to speak before the auction. He did not tell Vivienne. What Carter did not know was that Walter Okafor had made his own call on the Monday after Mason authorized the auction registration. That call was to an acquaintance at the state attorney's office, a woman named Linda Cho, who handled commercial fraud. Walter had simply told her that he had come across a certified legal letter carrying the signature of a deceased attorney, and that the letter had been used as pressure in a property acquisition attempt. He had scanned the letter and emailed it to her. Linda Cho had opened the email on Tuesday. She had looked at the signature. She had pulled Gerald Booth's death certificate from the records database. She had printed both documents and set them side by side on her desk. She had made 2 calls of her own. On Friday, 8 days before the scheduled auction, an investigator named James Pryor arrived at Carter Pruitt's office at Holt Meridian Group. He arrived at 11 in the morning. He brought 2 colleagues. Carter's assistant, a quiet woman named Grace, who had worked at the firm for 7 years, watched them arrive through the glass wall of her office. She watched Carter stand from his desk. She watched his face. Not surprise, not anger. Something closer to calculation, running and failing. Grace had known about the certified letter. She had known the name of the attorney. She had Googled Gerald Booth 3 weeks ago, alone at her desk at 7 in the evening, and read his obituary, and sat very still for a moment, and closed her browser and gone home. She had not said anything. She had told herself it wasn't her business. She watched James Pryor set a folder on Carter's desk. She watched Carter look at the folder and not open it. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Vivienne's personal line. It said, "You need to come to the office now," it said. "Not in an hour now." Vivienne arrived in 11 minutes. She was still in the clothes she had been wearing at a breakfast meeting. She walked into the office and looked at the investigators. She looked at Carter. She looked at Grace, who met her eyes through the glass with an expression that had in it everything Grace hadn't said for 3 weeks. James Pryor introduced himself. He introduced his colleagues. He set a second folder on Carter's desk and slid it toward Vivienne. He said, "This is a copy for you. We'll need to speak with both of you, but separately." Vivienne opened the folder. Inside was a copy of the certified letter. Below it was Gerald Booth's death certificate. Below that were records of Carter's visits to the storage facility. Below that were phone records. And below those, at the bottom of the stack, slightly dog-eared at one corner, was a printed copy of an email. The email was from Carter Pruitt to a man named Douglas Favre, dated 2 days after the storage unit meeting. The subject line was, "Silver Cloud. Need assessment stage low before we move." The body of the email contained 3 sentences. The room was quiet. Not the quiet of nothing happening. The quiet of a room in which everyone has just finished pretending. Vivienne looked at Carter. He said nothing. He was looking at a point on the wall above the window. The way a man looks at something that isn't there. Because the thing that is there is something he cannot look at. Grace opened her office door and walked out and stood beside Vivienne. She set a second printed document on the table. She said, "I have the storage facility's internal records from September." Carter contacted the manager on the 14th. "There's a note log." She set her hand on the document and slid it toward James Pryor. "I should have said something sooner." She looked at Vivienne. "I'm sorry." Vivienne looked at the papers. She looked at Grace. She looked at Carter. Carter was escorted from the building at 12:58 in the afternoon. He carried nothing. His office remained as he had left it. The silver cufflinks on the desk blotter. The coffee cup half empty. The chair pushed back at an angle. Vivienne stood in the empty office for a moment after they were gone. She pressed both hands flat on the cold surface of Carter's desk. She stood like that for a count of 5. Then she straightened. She asked Grace for Mason Wyatt's number. She called at 3 in the afternoon. Mason answered on the second ring. He was on a maintenance call at the Fenwick apartment complex, tightening a radiator valve in a first-floor unit. He had a wrench in his left hand. The phone was in his right. Vivienne said, "Mr. Wyatt, my name is Vivienne Holt. I believe we met at a storage unit on October the 3rd. Mason said, "I remember." She said, "I need to meet with you in person. At your convenience. There are some things I have to say to you, and I want to say them in person." Mason was quiet for a moment. He said, "I'm attending an auction on Saturday," she said. "I know." She paused. "I won't take much of your time before then. I only need enough to say what I should say." He said, "Tomorrow at noon. Walter Okafor's address." She said, "I'll be there." He said, "Bring anything Carter Pruitt had that related to the car." Vivienne was quiet. Then she said, "Yes, I will." She arrived at Walter's house at noon on Thursday with a leather briefcase and an expression that had in it none of the composed authority she had worn at the storage unit. She was wearing a gray blazer. Her hair was pulled back. She had not slept well in 4 days. Mason answered the door. He looked at her for a moment. He stepped aside to let her in. Walter was at the table. Adrian Walsh was there. Grace was there too, because Mason had asked Walter to ask her. Because she had been one to produce the storage records. And he thought she should be in the room. And Callie was there, sitting on the kitchen floor with a set of colored pencils and a drawing pad. Pip propped against her knee. She looked up when Vivienne walked in, studied her briefly, and went back to her drawing. Vivienne set the briefcase on the table. She opened it. She removed a folder and set it in front of Mason. She said, "These are Carter's internal communications about your car, the firm's full correspondence. I've submitted copies to the investigator, but these are yours." She paused. "I also want to say that the appraisal Carter arranged, the $900 valuation, was staged. He hired the appraiser. I didn't know that when it was done. I should have known. It was my firm, and I signed off on the approach without asking questions I should have asked." "The room was quiet," Vivienne said. "I was wrong, not because Carter deceived me, though he did. I was wrong because I looked at you and your daughter, and that car and I made a decision about what you were worth before I understood what I was looking at. I used your situation as a pressure point. And what Carter did on top of that was criminal, but what I did was wrong before he ever sent that letter." She said it clearly. She did not deflect. She did not soften it. She named each thing. Mason looked at the folder. He looked at the table. He did not look at Vivienne. Walter looked at his coffee cup. Adrian Walsh said nothing. Grace, sitting to the left of Vivienne, looked at her hands. Vivienne said, "I don't expect anything from you. I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not here to ask for it. I just needed to say it plainly." She was quiet then. Callie got up from the floor. She walked across the kitchen in her socks, Pip held against her chest. She walked to where Vivienne was sitting. She stopped in front of her and looked up at her with steady dark eyes. Vivienne looked down at her. Callie said, "My mom's car was always worth it. Not anger, not accusation." 7 words delivered with the same flat certainty a child uses to correct an adult about the color of the sky. The room was quiet in a different way after that. Vivienne looked at the little girl. Her expression shifted. Not breaking, but something close to it. Something that moved across her face and settled. She did something then that no one had asked her to do, and that no authority in the room required. She leaned forward and lowered herself off the chair, coming down to Callie's height, kneeling on Walter Okafor's kitchen floor in her gray blazer and her flat shoes, until she was looking at the 6-year-old at eye level. She said, "You're right. It was always worth it." Callie looked at her for a moment. She held Pip out. Vivienne looked at the stuffed elephant, the single remaining eye, the worn fabric ears. She took Pip carefully in both hands and looked at the elephant the way you look at something that has been through a great deal and come out whole on the other side. She handed Pip back. Callie tucked the elephant back under her arm and walked back across the kitchen to her drawing pad and sat back down on the floor and picked up her pencil. Mason was looking at the table. His jaw was set. His hands were flat on the folder in front of him. He said, "Thank you for coming." Vivienne stood. She straightened her jacket. She picked up her briefcase. She said, "Good luck on Saturday." She turned and walked to the door. She opened it herself. She let herself out. The door closed behind her. The room was still for a moment. Walter picked up his coffee cup. Adrian Walsh turned a page in his notebook. Grace looked at the folder on the table. From the kitchen floor, Callie said, without looking up from her drawing, "Daddy, is the car going to be okay?" Mason looked at her. He looked at Pip leaning against her knee. He looked at the colored pencils, the drawing she was making. The shape of a car emerging on the page in silver and blue. He said, "The car's going to be fine." He pulled the folder toward him. He opened it. He began to read. Saturday arrived the way important days tend to, looking exactly like an ordinary one. 6:45 in the morning. Gray light at the bedroom window. The apartment quiet except for the sound of Callie's feet on the floor, and then her voice from the hallway asking if they were going to the auction place today. Mason was in the kitchen making oatmeal. He said yes. She appeared in the doorway with Pip. She was wearing her blue sweater and her new winter boots, still a little stiff at the ankle. She looked at the stove. She looked at her father's back. She said, "Can I bring Pip?" He said, "Of course." She came and sat at the table. He served the oatmeal. He poured orange juice. He sat across from her. They ate without talking for a while. the way they had gotten used to eating. Not in sadness. Exactly, but in a kind of comfortable weight, the weight of two people who have learned that silence can mean presence rather than absence. Callie set Pip on the table beside her bowl. She looked at the elephant. She said, "Do you think Mom would have wanted us to sell it?" Mason looked at her for a moment. He said, "Your mom used to say that things shouldn't sit still. She said things want to be in the world." He paused. She said that car deserved someone who would really see it. Callie thought about this. She stirred her oatmeal. She said, "Is the auction a place where people really see things?" He said, "The right people." She said, "Okay." They finished breakfast. Mason washed the bowls. He put on his jacket, a newer one, dark navy, no fraying at the cuff. Walter had suggested it. He had thought about saying it wasn't necessary. He had put it on without arguing. He took Callie's hand. She held Pip against her chest with the other arm. They walked down the 3 flights to the parking lot. The air was cold and clear. The sky was the particular blue of a mid-October morning in the county. Pale at the edges, deep overhead, the kind of sky that looks clean and permanent. He opened the truck door for Callie. He lifted her up. She settled into the seat and set Pip on her lap and buckled her seatbelt with the click she always waited to hear. He walked around the truck. He opened his door. He sat in the driver's seat and held the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about Elena. He thought about that photograph in the kitchen drawer. Her hand on the hood, laughing, Callie on her hip. He thought about how she had never treated the car like something to be protected. She had treated it like something alive. He started the engine. He drove. The Hemsley Burn auction floor was already filling when they arrived at 9:20. There were 114 registered bidders. 11 had sent representatives by phone or digital proxy from London, Geneva, and Tokyo. The room had the particular quality of rooms where a great deal of money is present but not displayed. Understated, warm, the chairs covered in a dark green fabric, the lighting amber rather than white. The silver cloud, too, was on the floor. It had been detailed, carefully, conservatively, exactly as Adrian Walsh had specified. Nothing false, nothing concealed. The original paint, the original leather, the cracked taillight even, left as is, disclosed in the catalog, because provenance is not perfection, and the people in this room knew the difference. Walter was already there. He met Mason at the door and shook his hand and looked at Callie and said, "Are you ready?" Callie said, "Yes." She held Pip up briefly, as though the elephant should also be consulted. Then she tucked Pip back under her arm. Adrian Walsh was at the registration desk. He saw Mason, walked over and said, "There are 6 serious bidders. Proxy line is already active from 2 international houses." He said, "I'll be honest with you. I've been doing this for 40 years and I have not been this certain about a floor before." Mason said, "What do you think it'll do?" Adrian said, "I think it does 7." Mason nodded. He did not smile. He looked across the room at the car. It looked different in this light. Not bigger, not more polished, not more important, just more itself. Silver paint that had faded in a specific, unrepeatable way over 62 years. Leather worn at the driver's seat in a crescent where a hand had rested crossing it for decades. The smell of it, even from across the room. Oil and age, and something beneath both of those. Something that had no accurate name. Callie walked beside him toward the car. She held Pip in the crook of her elbow. She reached out and touched the car's rear fin with 2 fingers. Very gently, the way she touched things she didn't want to disturb. She said, "It smells like Grandma's pictures." He looked at her. She said, "The pictures Mom kept." In the box, he said, "Yeah." He said, "Yeah, it does." They stood beside the car for a moment. The room was filling. Paddles were being distributed. People in good shoes walked past them, turned, looked at the car, made small notations in their catalogs. No one looked at Mason with particular attention, not with the recognition of someone they knew. not with the awareness that this man in the navy jacket, standing beside the 6-year-old, with the stuffed elephant, was the owner. He was just a man standing beside a car in a room full of people who understood what the car was. He was all right with that. At 10:05, Adrian Walsh walked to the podium. He said the lot number. He said the year. He said the maker. He described the provenance in 4 precise sentences. He read the documented commission. He read the name. The room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically. The way a room shifts when a door opens somewhere and the air pressure changes. Almost imperceptible, except that you feel it. Then Adrian said, "We'll open bidding at 1.2 million. A paddle went up. Mason put his hand on Callie's shoulder. She leaned against him slightly. Pip pressed between her arm and her side and looked up at the board where the numbers were beginning to climb. 1.4, 1.7, 2.1. She was watching the numbers the way she had watched the room at the storage unit 6 weeks ago, with that steady, patient attention, the attention of a child who has learned to wait for things to become clear. 2.8, 3.3, 3.9. Mason looked at the car. He thought about Elena saying, "Things want to be in the world." He thought about her laughing with her hand on the hood. He thought about the photograph in the drawer. 4.6, 5.2. He thought about a kitchen drawer, a birth certificate, a maintenance license, a winter morning when the soup was on the stove and the phone rang at 9 minutes past 9, and everything after that had been managed one day at a time. 5.8, 6.4. The bidding was down to 2. A proxy line from London. A man in the back row with a gray beard and a still expression, who had raised his paddle twice and not once looked away from the car. 6.8. The London line. 6.9. The man in the back row. He raised his paddle one more time. His expression did not change. 7.1. A pause. Adrian Walsh looked at the room. He looked at the phone line. He said, "Do I have 7.2? The line was quiet. He said it again. The line was quiet. He raised his gavel. He said, "Sold $7.1 million. The room applauded, a clean, measured sound, the sound of people who appreciate things without performing it. Callie looked up at Mason. She said, "Is that good?" "Yes." She said, "Is it enough?" He looked at her. He thought about the water heater. He thought about winter boots. He thought about 3 months of storage fees and a cracked dashboard and 114,000 miles. He said, "It's more than enough." She thought about this. She looked at Pip. She looked back at him. She said, "Can we still have pancakes?" He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite sadness, and was, in fact, something older than either of those. He said, "Yeah, let's have pancakes." He reached down and took her hand. She took his. She held Pip against her chest with her other arm. The elephant's remaining eye looking out over the room as the bidder in the back row was approached by 2 members of the auction staff. And the Silver Cloud 2 sat on the floor under the amber lights, exactly as it had always been. Imperfect, specific, irreplaceable. They walked toward the door together. His hand around hers, her new boots on the auction floor, the murmur of the room behind them. He pushed the door open with his shoulder. The cold air came in. They stepped out into the October morning, and the door swung shut behind them, and he was already reaching into his jacket pocket for the truck keys.